Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar from the Summer Institute for Garden-Based Teaching. As you come in, if you haven't already, please make sure to check out slido.com and use code 80223. We will be using that to poll for a couple of questions throughout today's session, and we have one already live and ready for you all now. My name is Brianne Studer. I am the Director of Programs for Friends of the National Arboretum and the Washington Youth Garden. If you have been on any of these webinars or discussions before, you have seen me already. We are really excited to get started with this week's session. The first week, What is Your Why, was very theoretical, finding your purpose for your school garden. And then we focused a little bit more on how do you build your school garden, before now getting into the nitty-gritty of what does it take to be able to plant and maintain your school garden. So just a couple of reminders. Laura, can you go to the next slide, please? This is the third webinar. Next Tuesday's discussion session, the Ask a Gardener discussion session, will actually be the time where we dig into a lot of the questions that you all have throughout the day that any of you have filled out in the survey that you filled out previously, or any that you email us in between now and that discussion section. Then next week, we will also have our webinar on outdoor classroom management with City Blossoms. Before we have our discussion session after that, will actually be about school gardens in response to COVID. Then we will have Teaching in the Garden, standards-based curriculum and great tools to use for your garden. Before the final discussion session will really be your opportunity to come in to talk with your peers about the curriculum that you all are looking forward to doing in some capacity with your schools this year. Laura, next slide, please. So just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so please make sure to keep your audio muted. And unlike the last ones where we had some time at the end for Q&A, this time we will not necessarily have that because the whole next Tuesday session will be all on FAQs. So we will also upload this webinar to Schoology, our course website, and then eventually we will also put it up on YouTube, and that will include automatic captioning as well. And as I said already, if you haven't already, check out slido.com and use the code listed here so that you can answer our poll questions throughout the webinar. Next slide. Now today we have 4 excellent presenters that are really going to guide you all through the nuts and bolts of garden skills that our school gardens really need. We've got an excellent team here at Washington Youth Garden with a very diverse set of farming and gardening experiences, starting with Nadia Mercer, who is currently our Director of Institutional Relations and has actually worked for Washington Youth Garden for over 10 years, starting as garden intern, garden manager, program director. She has a diversity of experiences with Washington Youth Garden, and she is a passionate home gardener as well. And she will be talking about the importance of soil. Then Allie Arnold is our offsite program manager. She focuses on school garden partnerships and started her work with Washington Youth Garden as the WIG Food Corps Service member at KIPP Web Campus. That if you were on the first webinar, you heard a little bit more about that one. She is going to talk about your planting plan and want to actually plant. Emilia Kawashima is our garden coordinator, and she actually started as our garden and programs intern last year. And thankfully, she has a deep love for all things heat and summer from her growing up in Florida, and we're thrilled to have her back again this year. She's going to be talking about weeding and watering. And then lastly, we have our current garden manager, Xavier, who's going to be, has a wealth of experience from a variety of different farms in the area, including Claggett Farm, Three Part Harmony Farm in DC, and most recently was a market manager for Fresh Farm for quite some time, and brings a lot of really existing relationships with farmers that he leans on now as he tries to battle raccoons and other pests. And thankfully, that's what he's going to talk to us about today. So as I mentioned, today we are going to start with soil. And so for that, I'm going to pass it over to Nadia Mercer.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining. I am going to be talking about the importance of soil and how to know what kind of soil you have, and then how to make adjustments and amendments to your soil to make it the best home for your plants. And then I'm just going to briefly touch upon compost, because I know there's some of you out there who really want to know a little bit more about composting. So let's get started. So why is soil so cool? Okay, I like telling students all about soil and how it isn't just dirt, it's actually a living thing. It's not just a home for your plants. While that is a really important job that it has, is it makes sure that your plants have somewhere to live and a way to stay upright and rooted in the ground, but it is a living thing. So a cool fact about soil, is that there are more living things in a tablespoon of soil than there are people on this planet. Okay, and another cool thing about soil is that it is where most of our food comes from. So even a hamburger, you can trace back to the soil. A cow eats corn and grass, right? And that grows in the soil. So without it, we wouldn't have any of the food that we love eating today. Next slide. All right. So how can we provide the best home for our plants? Just like any living thing that we're taking care of, we want to understand what that living thing needs and what type of environment it will thrive in. So your plants will be happy if you give them the soil composition, the soil texture, and the pH level that they need. And luckily for us, for most vegetable plants, it's pretty similar across the board. And so I'm mainly going to be talking about vegetable gardening today, but I know some of you are probably doing perennial fruits too, so I'll touch on that just a little bit. So soil composition, there are three main types of soil, as you might remember from science class. There's sand, which is the big particles, silt, which is the medium-sized stuff, and clay, which is really, really small. And so for our gardens, we want a mixture of sand, silt, and clay called loam, and then a lot of organic matter or compost on top. That's the stuff that provides all the nutrients, like the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and calcium, for example. So you want your soil to be easy to work, and like the picture shows, you want it to be a dark brown, and that's how you can tell it has enough organic matter and not like a pale, sickly color. And as for texture, you want it to have a nice crumbly feeling. Like I like to compare a good soil to a nice, moist, crumbly chocolate cake. So if you have that texture, you're doing good. And when you water the soil, if the soil drains but doesn't run out too fast, and if the water doesn't pool on top of the soil, then you're doing good. You know that there's enough air pockets in there and it's not too compact. And then finally, your soil pH is really important. And that's because if you have a soil that is too acidic or too alkaline, then the nutrients that you're adding to the soil won't be available for the plants. They will have a really hard time absorbing those nutrients, and that will inhibit their growth. So a good soil pH for vegetables is between 6 and 7 for most things, but I do have, I think in the notes at some point, a list of pH that's good for all plants if you want to get specific. Like for example, blueberries, they like a more acidic soil, so between 4 and 5. All right. So, soil testing. There's a lot of things that we can tell about our soil just from observing it and looking at it. Whether it is clay-based, you would be able to tell if it's really hard and the water's pooling at the top, we would know that it has too much clay. But there's some things that we can't tell just from looking at it, and that's when we need to do soil testing. And one of those things is heavy metals. So it's really important that we do a test, especially to see if we have any heavy metals like lead in our soil. Because if we do, we obviously don't want to be growing food and eating it and giving it to students if it's also absorbing lead. So there's two different kinds of soil tests you can do. You can have the experts do it for you, which at Washington Youth Garden, we use University of Massachusetts Extension Service. They have a soil and plant testing lab, and they have really good instructions that I've included in the notes as well, and will upload to Schoology. It's a great activity to do with kids. Basically, it's really simple. You choose which area of your garden you want to test. Then you use a clean spade or trowel to take cup-sized samples. You only go 4 to 6 inches underneath the surface of the soil. You want to let the soil completely dry out before you put it in a labeled Ziploc bag. And then you send it in the mail to the lab. I think UDC also does it, and maybe University of Maryland. A lot of the land-grant universities will do this, but UMass is the one that I'm familiar with. Or you can do it yourself. So another fun thing to do with kids, especially in connection with science, is you can get a rapid test is what we've used before, and it comes with 4 tests that test your soil for pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Okay, next slide. All right, so here in this slide, you can see the results we got from UMass for a soil test that we did for Washington Youth Garden. You can see at the top, I circled the pH level, so it's 6.9, which was in the good range. And then also, sorry, the comments are popping up. You can see that our lead level is low, so that's really good. And then you can see that we have about 10% organic matter in our soil. So these are some of the things you might want to look at. You also want to look at those macronutrients, the phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and later on I will talk about if you are low in those things, what can you do? What can you add to your soil? So yeah, check out those sample instructions because they're really helpful. Okay, so what do we need to do to adjust or amend our soil? So when I use the word amend, that just means things that you can put in your soil to adjust and make it better for your plants. They're also called amendments. So here's some quick tips. If your soil is too hard or you have poor drainage, that's often clay soils, you need to add stuff that will create more air pockets. So here are some things that you can create. You can add coarse sand, not fine beach sand, but you want it to be the coarse stuff, compost, peat moss, or our favorite at Washington Youth Garden is coconut coir, which is a lot like peat moss in terms of its texture, but it's cheaper and it doesn't add any acid to the soil like peat moss does. Let's say your soil is too loose and it dries out really quickly. What can you do? You can add, again, compost or humus. You can add peat moss again, or you can add manure and sawdust. All these things will help soak up water and help get your soil texture right. Next slide. Okay, if you find out from your tests that your soil is really low or it's too acidic, these are some of the things you can add. You could add lime, pulverized limestone, or wood ash. And if it's too high or too alkaline, you could add sulfur, again, peat moss, or organic materials like compost. Okay, and then for nitrogen deficiency, again, compost, worm castings, which is another form of compost, composted manure, or even bloom, which I will talk about later. It's biosolids. And let's say you've already planted and you just want to give your plants a quick fix or a feed throughout the year. This won't improve your soil, but it'll help your plants get nitrogen. And we recommend, if you want them to access it quickly, is a liquid fertilizer like fish emulsion or compost tea. Okay, and then for potassium, we have bone meal that you can buy at the store, at a garden store. And for phosphorus, kelp or green sand. Kelp is often called green sand. Okay, so those are just some. I'm sure there's more. So let's see the poll that you responded to when you joined. I'm curious about what you are growing in today or now, or what you hope to grow in at your school. Brianne, can you show the poll results? Not sure if she can show the poll results right now, but I will just keep, oh, here we go. Awesome. Raised beds, containers, 50% of people are growing in the ground, and not sure yet, vertical towers. No rooftop gardens at our schools. Okay, well, thanks for doing that poll. Looks like we have a lot of representation in all the growing vehicles. If there's something that I didn't put in the poll, please put it in the chat that you're growing in. All right, so let's move on to how we can fill our raised beds or our containers. What should we consider? Okay, so here I have an example of a 4x8 by 1 foot raised bed. These are very common at school gardens. And now you have your nice bed built, but what should you add to it to fill it? So these are some suggestions. 50% topsoil. So you just don't want to get like construction grade landfill soil, not landfill soil, but construction soil. But topsoil is good because those will have the minerals that you need. And then 40% compost. So that's the humus, the organic matter, all the nutrients are in that compost. It could also be leaf mold that you add to this at this point, although that's less nitrogen than compost. And then 10% something that's a soilless growing mix. So something that will make sure that your container or raised bed doesn't get too compact. So again, we recommend coconut coir, which you can get online in pretty and like good size bags or blocks that then you have to hydrate so that it falls apart. And then you just want to remember that it's really important to top your bed as much as you can with mulch. And mulch could be wood chips, straw, leaf grow, just garden scraps that you've let dry or grass clippings that you've let dry and put on top of your bed. So after you do this, you just want to water it all in and test your soil to see if you need to make any adjustments using the amendments we already talked about. Okay, and I also included a video that we're not going to watch right now because it's long, but it's in the notes, and it's a video that I thought was really good of this guy who's an urban gardener filling his raised bed and what he puts in it. His raised bed is a little bit higher, And when that happens, you have a lot more space to fill and it can get a lot more expensive. So he has some good ideas of how to keep it cheap by adding more logs and other things at the bottom, because your plant roots actually only absorb, for vegetables, they only absorb nutrients from like the top 12 to 6 inches of soil. So if your bed's much deeper than that, you don't really need to put a lot of compost at the bottom. Okay, next slide. All right, so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about organic matter. So I've added some more slides here about that. I just think that organic matter, it comes in many forms, but it is like your grandmother's cure-all. Like if you were ever sick and your grandmother gave you apple cider vinegar or whatever it was, gin, this is like the best thing you can do for your soil, especially for vegetable gardening. Adding any type of organic matter will eventually improve your soil and your plants will be really happy. So if you don't have time to figure out exactly what the pH is or exactly what levels of potassium and calcium and nitrogen you have, it's safe to say that if you add compost or any kind of organic matter, it will help. Okay, so it'll help get you that chocolate cake type soil that we want to see. So I just wanted to note that you do need to refresh your organic matter between plantings. So if you pull out your spring crops and before you plant your summer crops, this is a great time to add compost and organic matter again, and same in the fall. And that's because when we're doing annual vegetable planting, it's really nutrient intensive. These plants, since they're annuals, they suck up a lot of nutrients. They leave the soil depleted. And so we have to add it back in at least once a year, but even better to do it between plantings. And also, anytime there's a big rainstorm, a lot of those nutrients might run off. Just another note though, if you are growing perennial herbs or fruit trees or fruit shrubs, just note that they don't need as much compost like annual vegetable gardenings. And in fact, some perennial herbs will suffer if you add too much compost. So it's better to heavily mulch those things with a carbon-based mulch like wood chips. Okay. All right, so next, or this slide, just wanted to give a little shout out to mulch. It is so good to, over time, improve your soil, but while you're using it, it will suppress weed growth. It will conserve water in the soil by keeping the soil cool and shaded. And there's a lot of different things you can use for mulch. Straw or leaves are two good ones for annual vegetable beds. And then I love cover crops. I know that it's not, it doesn't make too much of a difference in school gardens, but for big farms, it's amazing. And we use it at the youth garden on our 1 acre farm, and we've used it at school gardens in raised beds. But cover crops are a really good thing to plant in between your edible crops. So some cover crops, I mean, they're basically just seeds. If you don't know, look it up, but they're seeds that you can buy in bulk, and they're very cheap, that will help improve your soil. Some add nitrogen. They will make sure that you're not leaving your soil bare so that weeds start growing in your soil or that your nutrients in your soil run off, but this cover crop will hold on to those nutrients, and then when you're ready to plant, you mow those cover crop down, you turn them back into the soil, and the nutrients that are left in that oat or that rye will slowly release back into your soil. So you're keeping your nutrients in your soil using cover crop. Okay, next slide. Okay, so where do you get some of this stuff? here are some tips of places to get bulk materials to fill your garden beds. I included links so you can do more research later, but just know that if you do decide to get bulk delivery, which will save you money and a lot of plastic from using bags, you'll obviously need you'll need space for a big truck to enter your school garden or close to your school garden and dump a big pile of stuff, whatever it is. So just make sure, like we've had difficulties with that before where we've ordered something and the truck's coming and the driver's a little bit irritated and he's like, where do I go? But it's all doable. It just takes a little more coordination, and then you have this beautiful bulk pile to distribute to your garden. Okay, and one thing that we often get asked is, how do we know how many yards or cubic yards we need of a certain material? So I included a soil calculator or a bulk calculator in the notes, and it's really helpful. Oh, let me just talk about Bloom really quick. So if you guys don't know about Bloom, it is a Class A composted human manure, DC's finest. So it's a DC water product, and it takes DC's waste from our toilets and composts it in a very safe way. And it's a good nitrogen compost source, and it's been tested and tested. It's really safe, and I believe that they will deliver it free or fairly cheap to schools. We've used it at the youth garden, and I've been amazed at the results. All right, next slide. Okay, so I have a poll question. Are you composting at your school? We're gonna do a quick 4-minute session about composting before we move on to the good stuff of planting. So if you, oh, okay. So here we can see it, garden waste only. Great, 3-bin system, can't wait, 25%, 20%, no, but I want to, compost tumbler. Okay, I don't see any worm bins in here. Oh, classroom worm bin, there we go. Things are changing before my eyes. Amazing. Okay, garden waste only is winning so far. Oh, we've got it. Oh, classroom worm bin is winning in a turn of events. Great, so let's talk quickly about composting. Thanks for sharing that. So next slide. Composting and compost is really cool, and it's a great teaching tool, but I just want to say that it is a lot of work to actually compost your school's food waste. So if you're managing and sustaining, if managing and sustaining your school garden currently is a challenge and takes up a lot or too much of your time, that you might want to start small and then grow to try to change the world through composting. So let's talk about why it's such a great thing to do. So composting keeps organic matter out of landfills, reduces waste, and allows you to recycle nutrients in your plants and give new life to your garden. It's an amazing teaching tool to teach environmental stewardship, science, and biology, and to increase your students' comfort touching soil. It can empower students by engaging them in meaningful work, such as recycling food waste and making compost. It also teaches empathy for non-human living things by taking care of worms, which is a lot easier than taking care of guinea pigs. And if you do start a 3-bin system and can offer community members, neighbors to come use it and drop off their compost, you are building community as well. Next slide. So the basics of taking care of compost. Okay, so composting is exactly what we need to survive and thrive: air, food, and water. And I always call the FBI and ask them to come over and help with the compost pile. They are our fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates, and they're really who we're keeping alive in our compost pile. So we have to turn the compost pile regularly. We have to add water. Turning the compost pile gives it the air so that it doesn't get anaerobic and start to rot. But so the fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates actually have air to breathe. And they also need water too. And these are our decomposers. So what kind of food do we need to give our compost pile? Basically, it is broken down into carbon sources and nitrogen sources. So you want a 30-to-1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen to have a healthy, sweet smelling compost pile that quickly decomposes. So the brown stuff is like, you can see in the chart, dried leaves, dried grass clippings, wood chips, and small branches. You need a much larger percentage of that stuff, it's 30-to-1, than nitrogen. So mostly the food that you're composting is a lot smaller scale than the brown stuff. So the nitrogen includes like fresh grass clippings instead of dried ones, fruits, veggies, coffee grounds, even eggshells, which are also a good calcium source. And if the carbon to nitrogen ratio is too high, like if there's way too much carbon, then decomposition will slow down. And if it's way too much nitrogen, then you will end up with like a rotting, stinky pile. So these are just some things to consider, and also note that you should not try to compost meat, bones, grease, animal products in general in your compost pile. Next slide. Okay, so here is basically our recommendation for phasing into composting. And I'm sorry I can't go into this more, but if you have questions, we'll talk about it in a discussion session. I know a lot of people are already composting garden waste, which I think is the first thing that you should figure out, because you're going to have a lot of things you're pulling out of the garden and you don't just want to throw them away. So I like this picture of this hardware cloth. That's what that's called. Somebody made a bin using hardware cloth and stakes, and they're putting their dried leaves and plants that they pull out of the garden. After they dry, you can dry them on a picnic table or on the ground and then plop them in there. And this will they'll break down eventually, and you could probably use them as mulch. Now, if they're diseased or really nasty weeds, you just want to throw them away. Then you really want, number two, if you really want to start composting food waste, but you don't have it set up yet, you can always bring it to District Public Works. Has a food waste drop-off at all the farmers markets in DC. So check out if there's one near you. And if you want to bring your classroom's food scraps or more, you could drop it off at the farmers market. Then the worm bins in the classroom many of you are doing. We have a little guide on how to start your own worm composting that we'll put on Schoology. But just so you know, Brianne said that her and her husband used 3 worm bins to compost their food waste that they produced in their household. So they don't do a lot of food waste, but it is still an incredible teaching tool. Then I'd say a tumbler is a really good start if you want to do both garden waste and some food waste. But I would recommend adding a smaller bin to put the finished stuff or stuff that you want to finish, to take it out of there and put it in a bin to really finish. Okay, and then number 5 is this big, awesome 3-bin system where you have to water and turn the piles, and the last bin is where you keep the finished stuff. And then if you're a lucky school, you can have a partnership with an industrial composting facility through Department of General Services Organics Recycling Program that will help you with all your waste and recycling and composting. So I added links to that DGS partnership in the notes. Okay, so that was my section. We talked all about soil, a little bit about compost. Now let's get to the fun stuff of planting. So here's Allie.
It's so funny, Nadia. Composting is fun. Soil is fun. But
It is.
Yeah, that is really the foundation for everything. So it really is so important. Yeah, so go to that Slido for the next poll question, which is going to be, why are you growing a garden? And have a bunch of questions there where you can select multiple options. But I'm going to take you through kind of 3 sections. What kind of garden do you want to plant and why? A selection of top 10 plants to grow in your school garden, and some digital tools that you can use to plan out when to grow what. So this is fun to see real time, this moving. I see everyone is saying to inspire curiosity and a love of the earth. Well, not everyone now, but I think that's a theme that carries across almost anything you choose to plant. You will do this. So it's not too hard in school gardens. To delight and explore the senses. I love it. Sensory gardens are so lovely. To grow food. Yep, that's something that I'm going to focus a lot on in the top 10 plants. To teach STEM, to support pollinators. Yes, we love it. To teach art. Okay. Maybe more people will put in their answers, but this gave me a good sense for what you all are trying to do, what your purpose is for growing a garden. So yeah, a lot of you will probably have more than one purpose, and what you'll grow in the school garden will hit more than one of these purposes. But it is important to first consider what you want to grow or why you want to grow before you can plan what it is you're going to grow. Because it'll also determine if you want to include students in the planning process or other community voices in your planning. So these first pictures here, if you can guess what this is targeted for, you can throw it in the chat, but I'll tell you now. This is really targeted to feed your community, to grow food. The kale on the left are 2 types. They're planted pretty closely. It's pretty much maximizing the space. And I don't think you can really see, but in between the redhead lettuce are baby okra seedlings, which is something we do so that the okra has a little time to grow while the red lettuce is also growing, so that it's less time to harvest the okra. And yeah, for this type of garden, you'll want to know, what do people want to eat? If you're growing it to really feed your community and to distribute harvests, which is something Lola said in the first webinar, which is just kind of listen and notice what people are bringing to potlucks, and even survey them to know what do people want to eat. But another thing to consider is, when are you going to eat it with people? Are you going to eat it in the garden, or are you going to distribute it and harvest to your community? Because you might want to plant something like tatsoi, which is this kind of spinach-sized leaf that you can pick with kids, and it's child size. They could eat the whole thing, including the stem, and also is a little bit more of an inaccessible vegetable. So maybe your community does not really know what tatsoi is, so you wouldn't be super thrilled to see it when you're trying to give it away, but it is something that is good if you are facilitating it. So in person with kids or whoever you might be with. And yeah, so next slide is some examples of sensory gardens. If you are trying to really delight all of the senses. And on the upper left are a lot of colors, and you can see art in there, a lot of flowers. On the right 2 pictures are at Friendship Armstrong, actually, one of our partner schools. And that's a sensory garden bed that has lots of different perennial herbs, like mint, oregano, thyme, lavender, sage. It has almost everything you can think of, including those elephant ears, which shout out to Miss Williams. I'm not sure if she's on this call, but she planted, and the kids love those. It feels like a jungle when they grow a little bigger, and they can kind of hide behind the big leaves. And there's some flowers in there too. Another plant that you can't see here, but that we really like in sensory gardens is lamb's ear. And if you haven't felt, you might imagine it feels like a lamb's ear. It's very soft. The kids love it. A lot of those herbs there are great for smelling, and we often put sorrel in for tasting. It's just a leaf and stem, and it's really sour, and the kids really like it. They often say it tastes like airheads or like a sour lemon candy. And we often like rub mint on our teeth, and that's really fun, and it tastes like toothpaste or chewing gum. The next slide is something to consider if you want to teach something like math or science. Is maybe if you are trying to do that, you don't want to plant the things yourself. You want to include the kids in the process so that they can graph out the plots like they're doing there. They can learn about measurements. They can learn about calendars and actually do some of that planning and do some of that math of counting back. When do I want things to harvest? And so counting back, when do I have to plant? There's a lot of things that you can include to teach both math and science. Of course, so much is observational, and you can do other experiments. Gardens are just perfect for this kind of teaching, to really get kids to be hands-on and to see the process of something change and grow. Okay, the next slide are pollinator gardens. On the left there is one of our newly planted gardens at Henley Elementary. And pollinator gardens feature, as you might imagine, a lot of flowering plants, especially native perennials, which perennials are things that come back year to year rather than annuals, which you have to plant every year. And some examples of plants that might be featured in a pollinator garden are things like echinacea, goldenrod, sunflowers, milkweed, anise hyssop, coneflower, rudbeckia. There's so many. There are lots of lists online. If you search for DC or Zone 7, you'll find a lot, or just our area, you'll find a lot of lists on pollinator plants and native pollinators for perennials, for this area. And they're really great for also teaching art or inspiring art. I think any garden, honestly, that you plant can do this, but I do think that flowers are so attractive and so lovely and inspiring. So pollinator gardens are really great for that. But this picture all the way on the right is actually from a garden that doesn't have a pollinator garden. So just to show you that art can be inspired from kind of any plant or garden life. Okay, the next slide. Are more types of pollinator plants. As you can see right here, some a cute butterfly and bumblebee are on these mint flowers and this amaranth. And this picture to the right doesn't really show the pollinator very well. It really just shows that Cuban oregano taking over. But the fennel in the back is what I wanted to to talk about, to feature, which flowers and is great for pollinators because they loved the nectar in the flowers. Cuban oregano is actually a tropical plant, by the way. So if you do grow it in your gardens, you have to take it indoors in the winter. Okay, the next slide. So if you said that you wanted to, I can't remember if this was on the Slido. I don't think many of you clicked it actually, but to connect to your community's roots or to teach history, it's really important to acknowledge and remember that a lot of our things that we call sustainable agriculture or organic farming now really do stem from wisdom and knowledge that that come from people and practices in the African diaspora. And so this is a list of things, of plants, of practices that that stem from specifically the African continent and diaspora. And this was from a talk with Amani at Soulfire Farm. If you haven't heard of them, I definitely recommend you look them up. And also, if you're interested in farming wild black, this book is really, really great by Leah Penniman, also at Soulfire Farm. But you can see here, like soil testing, like Nadia mentioned, vermicompost, that's worm composting, irrigation, raised beds, things that, you know, a lot of us are doing really do stem from this tradition and these histories. And yeah, so a lot of these practices Indigenous people have been practicing for centuries, which I think is really important for anyone who's growing a school garden or agriculture to recognize and to teach. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so that now I want to share the top 10 plants to grow in a school garden. And of course, take this with a grain of salt. You can do whatever you want, but these are just some things that we picked out with you all in mind as teachers, or more like lower maintenance kind of plants and things that more fit to the school year, like the spring and the fall rather than the summer, which is not to say you cannot grow a lot of things in the summer, but just to recognize that it does take a lot of maintenance and work, and you might not have the time, or you might not be there then. Okay, so next slide. So the first one I want to share is what I think Nadia told me originally, and I'm sure I'm paraphrasing, but we'll make a turnip hater into a turnip lover. The hakurai turnip, it is a little Japanese turnip, salad turnip, so you can eat it raw. And yeah, I too have experienced this. I didn't think I really liked turnips before I tried this turnip. It is really so yummy and tender and kind of sweet, honestly. And as you can see, it's not many days to harvest. And to do a little exercise with you all, if you wanted some hakurai turnips on September 20th, when would you need to plant them in the ground? You can type it into the chat. And so turnips, you can direct seed, which means that you plant it right into the ground. You don't need to start it indoors. And is really fun, really simple. Yeah, bringing out your math word problems, exactly. Okay, we've got August 16th. Close. I mean, okay, here we go. You all are quick to the draw. Okay, I think you can click to the next slide. Yep, you all are right, August 15th. So obviously things vary. It doesn't, oh, sorry, can you go back? Yeah, the things vary, and it's not always exactly what it might say on the seed packet, or if you Google it, how many days to harvest, but generally you can plan on that. Exactly, always a little variation. Oh, another thing I wanted to mention is that a planting rule of thumb is generally for seeds, you plant them in the ground 2 times as deep as the seed is wide. So if your seed, like a turnip seed, pretty small, you plant, I mean, not even like a fourth of an inch, maybe you plant it 2 times the width of it into the soil. So not very deep at all. And that it'll also say that usually on seed packets, but that's just a general rule of thumb to remember. And yeah, with turnips, you would plant them maybe about 1 inch apart. But in the next slide, you might need to do something if you plant them closely. And generally, if you do plant them 1 inch apart, you'll probably need to thin them. So that's this technique of when the baby seedlings are coming up. You can see they have the first true leaves. So they have about 4 leaves on them at that point. You can pull them up out of the ground. I know it feels a little sad to get rid of this little plant baby who you planted originally, but in order to make the most of it, you can always eat it. Or I think most things you can eat like that, like microgreens, or just toss it to the side. It'll decompose pretty quickly on top of your soil. But yeah, so you can see the turnips here, they maybe weren't thinned super well, so that one second from the right is pretty small, so they just won't grow to their full size. And you can think about how much do you need to thin based on how big your plant is going to get in full maturity. Okay, next slide. So some more root vegetables that are really easy and I suggest are radishes. Radishes are super quick to harvest. They're really fun, they're a little spicy. I think Brianne says it's not a good radish if it's not spicy. So that'll tell you something. And watermelon radishes in particular are really cute because they have this pink in the middle, but there's so many different kinds. And carrots are another really fun one. It's just so great to be with kids in the garden and have them pull up a carrot and just see their excitement and amazement and wow of this root that grew so deep into the soil that they couldn't see until they pulled it up. But as you can see, it takes a little bit longer, a lot longer, 85 to 95 days to harvest. Kind of got to be patient with carrots. And same with potatoes, they're a little longer, 70 to 90 days. And I'll talk a little bit more about potatoes in the next slide. Potatoes are really, really awesome because they do have such a large seed. It's not the actual seed, but it's actually the full potato or the half of the potato when you plant it is going to clone itself and multiply underground. And it's really low maintenance. It's super easy. The greens and the stems pop up and grow for a while. And then when the greens and the tops die back, that's when you dig up the potatoes. And that is a really fun thing to do with kids. It's like a little treasure hunt. Okay, next one. Garlic. So I love garlic so much. It's really fun for kids to break apart. It also has a very large seed. You just plant the 1 clove in the ground. And if you get the hardneck variety, which is pretty traditional or classic, there's a scape that comes up out of that center stem, which is really the flowering part of the garlic. And you can just pull it up, and pulling it out or snipping it off redirects the energy down to the root and the bulb to finish growing to completion. And you can actually eat that scape and chop it up thinly or however like you would, and use it like you would garlic. It's got a really strong garlic flavor. A lot of people make pesto with it. Really yummy. And garlic has a really long growing period and a very strange one too. Garlic is kind of like the thing at the end, almost at the end of the fall season, you're tired, you forget about anything, but then you're like, oh wait, garlic, I can plant. Anywhere between the middle of October to even early November, you can plant garlic, and it grows until June. And it's around then when you harvest it, when the leaves start to yellow on the bottom, and you don't want to leave it too long because the garlic bulb can rot. Oh, and Sam has a fun garlic joke if he wants to write it into the chat. Next slide. Okay, greens. So this is, I'm cheating a little bit because I said greens is not one plant, but something like kale or collard greens or even callaloo, really popular in Caribbean cooking, are really, really great. They're a little bit more of a medium difficulty plant just because they do attract a number of pests and bugs. But to kind of help with that, you might plant greens as early as you can in the spring in like March, and then let it grow and harvest it in around June. And then when it starts to get buggy, you pull the plant up and then you plant another round again in sometime like late August to get a fall crop of greens. So that's a way to avoid some of those bug issues, so you don't have them attacking them all season. But they're a little bit not as long, 40 to 50 days to harvest, and they're very common. It's really, people really love greens. The next plant is, again, cheating here, lettuce or spinach, because they're kind of similar. You can direct seed them. And oh, I meant to say, sorry, if you go back to the next slide, or the last slide, with cooking greens like this, with kale or collards or whatever, you can transplant or you can direct seed them, either or. And transplanting, again, is when you start them indoors. And it just means you have to do a little bit more math. You have to count back 4 to 6 weeks generally for kale or other cooking greens like this, when to start it from seed indoors, and then 4 to 6 weeks until you can plant it outside. So that's something you could do, but also you can direct seed it. So the transplanting is if you are wanting to get the harvest a little earlier. Okay, next slide. So lettuce, spinach, another lovely one, super simple. You can direct seed and you can eat right from the garden. You can cut it and usually it will grow back and you'll get some more harvest too. Next one. So I love flowers, especially edible ones. And I know, again, I'm cheating because it's more than one plant here, but edible flowers are really, really awesome. There's so many kinds. This nasturtium is a little bit spicy. Borage tastes kind of like cucumber. Calendula is a really good medicinal or healing plant, but you can also eat it. And so a lot of herbs too have flowers that are edible, and even other plants that you might use the other plant parts, like arugula or kale, have flowers. Like arugula is spicy like the leaf, and kale tastes just like a kale flower tastes just like kale. And of course, if you're just growing these flowers, you want to leave enough for pollinators and beneficial insects, but you can also take some for yourself and for your students and community. Next one. This is just an example of some tatsoi and mustards that went to flower and they were really yummy. Next one. Beans and peas are really awesome. They're really easy. And they fix nitrogen in the soil. So like Nadia was talking about, nitrogen is really essential, and like cover crops do, and field peas, like was in the last slide. But beans and peas are really awesome. Also, just you get generally a pretty big crop from just a couple of plants, and often you can get around like 1 to 2 bushels from a couple of plants. And they're easy to pick and eat right there if you're doing it with students. Next one. Okay, millpot or Three Sisters. Again, cheating because it's more than one plant. But this is a really great crop system to grow, to both show companion planting and a companion planting example. The corn grows tall and acts as a trellis for the beans, which grow up it. The beans fix nitrogen. The melon and pumpkin or squash create kind of like this shady understory and with water retention. And so they all are mutually beneficial. And that's really cool to teach about with students. And also just the history of them, that indigenous people in the Americas and Mesoamerica have been growing this for centuries. And yeah, it's also a nutrition lesson because it's a well-balanced meal. You can think of it as if these things on your plate, the corn tortilla or just corn, the beans, and the pumpkin along the side or the melon. So lots of things from these three. Next one. And the last, I went over 10 for sure, but sunflowers. Sunflowers are just beautiful. Everyone seems to love them. They come back pretty easily and reseed themselves. And yeah, they're just gorgeous, and you can cut them and make little bouquets around your school. They're really, really lovely. So you can go to this Slido poll and share what is your favorite plant to grow with children. These are great. Yes, the birds love sunflowers. Beans, yes. Garlic, greens, mint, yes. Mint is one of those perennials that just never leaves and takes over. That is really, really awesome. Tomatoes, okay. Cranberry hibiscus, nice. Mung beans, fun. Broccoli flowers, kale, radish. Berries, yes. Berries are one I didn't talk about, but are really, really great. Perennials. Carrots, yep. Lettuce, bok choy, peppers. But peas, the one I missed. Well, oh no, I did say them with beans, I guess. Tomatoes, ooh, yep. So the reason I actually didn't include many fruiting plants like tomatoes or peppers on there is just because their growing season is usually kind of opposite from the school. And also they just take a lot of work with trellising, building supports for them and keeping them up, but they are really fun. Growing sun gold tomatoes are really fun to pick off the one fruit and pop in your mouth. Nice. Oh yes, wildflowers. Cool. Okay, so let's just get to the last final little section where I just want to share some tools. Now that you know what you want to plant, when do you plant them? So this is a resource that Washington Youth Garden has developed. It's called the Suggested School Garden Plant List. This is really long and probably hard to see in this format, but if you go to the next slide, this is on Schoology. Here are the fall crops that we've included here. So it lists the family, the crop, the variety. Really the most important thing for determining is the planting date range, the days to harvest, and whether or not you're going to transplant or direct seed it. And even some of those things that say transplant, like collards, you can direct seed it. You just have to count back a little more. And again, this plant list is for DC. We are Zone A. And I think Sam has another joke about to put it in the chat. But these are focused on edible plants. And so, yeah, that's all I want to say about this slide. The next one has an example planting plan. So you would take that information that you have in the last spreadsheet and then put it into here once you know what plants you want to grow. So if we're looking at fall, and let's say you want to plant spinach and you want to harvest it October 20th, you would count back 40 or 50 days, or 30 to 40 days, and put in the planting date. That's kind of how you plan it out. And this is something that you can do with students too. And yeah, that's it. I'm interested to hear if anyone has any planting plan specific questions, but I think because of time, we'll probably keep that for the next discussion section. And the next person who's going to talk is Emilia about weeding.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emilia. Thank you, Allie. Thank you, Nadia. And thank you all for joining us today. I love gardening, but I also love to dance. So let's all do a 5-second dance to get our blood moving. Blood moving. All right. Awesome. So I don't have a poll question for everyone, but I wanted to ask something to kind of get you in the mindset and think about maybe the next couple days, and you can bring your thoughts and questions to the discussion panel. So because we're going to be talking about maintenance, think about what needs attention in your garden space. So that could be many things, and maybe you don't have your garden space yet, and so that's why we're going to be talking about some of the more basic things. I'm going to touch on some weeding and some watering, and then pass it on to Xavier. So next slide, please. So weeding. A weed is just a plant that is growing where you didn't intentionally want it to grow, right? So why is it important? Weeds can be very overwhelming, especially for your baby plants and your plants that you're intentionally wanting to grow. So it's really important that you want to take them out so that your intentionally planted plants aren't competing for sunlight, water, and nutrients. So if you look at this nice picture on the right-hand side, we've got some beautiful yellow onions growing, but as you can see, this bed has not been weeded yet. We can see many different types of it too. And there's like a random red lettuce also growing in there, and that might have just flown from the wind from another plant or something. But specifically, we want to think about what types of plants are sensitive to weeding. So some are more sensitive than others. So for example, these onions and other root vegetables like garlic, they are very sensitive to weeds, especially because they're competing for those nutrients in the soil to get their roots in the ground. Sorry, can everybody hear me and see me okay? Okay. So we want to make sure that we get the weeds out of there, and you want to pull it out from the base and shake off the soil. Make sure you get the whole plant out, because as you can see from these photos here, a pigweed plant can produce up to 250,000 seeds, and crabgrass also 150,000 seeds. And these are two examples of very common weeds that you could find in your school gardens. So if you let those plants go to seed, I mean, just imagine how many weeds would come back up the next season. So we want to avoid that. some of the other plants that maybe are not as sensitive to weeds could be some of your leafy greens like kale and collards. Not to say that you shouldn't weed at all, but they may be not as sensitive as your onions and your garlic. So if you are doing lesson planning and wanting to talk about the importance of weeding and maintaining your garden with your students, maybe have the students focus on the root vegetable bed first, and then the next week or two you can kind of let the weeds go, and then attend to the leafy greens, since they can kind of withstand it a little more. But yeah, it's a great learning tool for kids, and you know, they can get their aggression out by pulling out the weeds. So it's a fun thing to do for them. Next slide, please. Some tips. So like I was saying, you don't want your weeds to go to seed. So especially if you see them flowering, you want to be like, uh-oh, like if those get pollinated, they're going to go to seed, and then I'm going to just have a million weeds next year. So make sure you pull them before that point, but ideally when they're small, you know, they'll be easier to pull out. Another tip to do is mulch, and Nadia did a great job talking about that when she was talking about the soil, because it has many purposes, right? So it protects, insulates, and enriches the soil. But in the case for weeding, if you do a good job weeding your bed and then you mulch on top and a nice thick layer, you want to always add more than you think. That will help suppress weeds growing, right? Because when there's like a thick layer above and there's no sunlight to come through, the weeds will have trouble growing. And mulch can be straw, grass clippings, leaves. Here we have even a picture of paper. It's not the prettiest, but you know, if you don't want to go and buy mulch, you can always use what you have around the schools or the garden that can easily decompose. Also, we want to, I touched on adjusting your technique based on the crop. So just to reiterate, garlic, onion, your like root vegetables are very sensitive to competing for that soil room and the nutrients in the soil when there's a lot of weeds growing, opposed to some leafy greens, which could probably wait it out a little bit. Also, another tip is to keep it simple. So for teachers, especially when you have several beds or areas that you're growing things in, it might be hard to keep track, or if you have other students and fellow teachers helping you, keep it simple, 1 to 2 types of plants per bed. So I don't know if you can see, but the photo on the right behind the text, there's a raised bed from one of our partner schools, Friendship Armstrong. There's turnips on one side and potatoes on the other. And you know, you can very easily tell the difference, that there's 2 different types there. And then the turnips were planted very nicely in rows, so you know that that anything strayed from that is most likely a weed, and you can have your students and teachers help do that. I didn't talk about tools, garden tools for weeding and maintenance things, but our friends at Common Good City Farm have a great video if you want to check that out to familiarize yourself with garden tools. And there's a link in the notes in the PowerPoint. Next slide, please. So another tip for weeding is, you know, not necessarily just weeding in the bed where you are growing your veggies, but also outside of it, or, you know, like in between your rows if they're in the ground. It would be good to manage your weeds by mulching around that area, because weeds can, I mean, they're like beasts, right? They can, if they have nutrients and they're known to grow in poor conditions, they can kind of creep into your garden areas and just take over. And so here are some awesome pictures from our partner school, KIPP Webb campus. On the left, we have the before, where, you know, it looks nice. There's grassy area, but, you know, the grass was just creeping into all of the beds, and it was kind of a pain. Plus, we put in an irrigation system, and, you know, the folks gotta mow the lawn, and there was just some issues there. So we decided to mulch the area and make it nice and clean. And because the grass was really unruly, we did the system where we put cardboard. So you can kind of see in the middle there, we have our cardboard or our sheet mulch on the first layer, and cardboard is paper, so eventually it will decompose. But it just adds like that extra layer, right, to suppress those weeds from growing back. The black fabric is weed block, or, you know, landscaping cloth, and you can get that from a hardware store. So that goes on top, and then you top it all off with some wood chips. And now you have these lovely pathways, and it's nice and clean, and you don't have to worry about weeding like crazy. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to get into too much of the nitty gritty, because I know that there's a lot of information out there about common weeds for this area. There's a lot of them. That's probably a good fun thing to do with your kids too, is look in the garden bed and recognize like what we planted, what's growing, but like how many different types of weeds can you find? You could probably find so many. But I'm just going to touch on a couple here, and you can go to the reference for on Schoology or on the internet. There's lots of things to look for. But wood sorrel, starting at the top left, also known as oxalis, kind of looks like a clover. It has nice heart-shaped leaves and yellow flowers, and it's actually edible. You can taste it, and it has like a citrusy sour flavor. But again, you know, if you're not wanting to have those take over, you want to make sure you pull them out. Another delicious one is lamb's quarters. That's the bottom below the wood sorrel. Also, just, you know, grows all over. You can eat them. They're great, but will take over. Upper right-hand corner is ground ivy. This one is a pain. It creeps everywhere if you don't pull it out by the root. It is pretty, I guess, but I mean, I have no sympathy now. Like, it's growing all over the demo garden, and you have to kind of yank them out, and they'll like strangle some of your plants. So that's also something that you want to make sure you're on top of, so that it doesn't get big enough and like cover so much ground that it actually starts climbing and strangling your veggies. And also wiregrass, which is a nightmare. That bottom right hand corner, it's just grass, but it has all of these like nodules that turn into more plants, and they like dig deep into the ground, and they're just like almost impossible to pull out. It is, yeah, truly a nightmare. So that's it. When you see that, you want to take that out and throw it away. You don't even want to compost it, because it will just take over wherever you drop it. So these are just a few, but there's so many, and it's a fun thing to do, to try and to find them with your kids and identify them while you're weeding the plots. Next slide. So again, here's another reference. So go ahead on your own time, go check that out. And next slide, please. I'm gonna touch on some watering tips before I hand it off to Xavier. So watering, this is something that is crucial, because just like us, plants need water to survive. So one of the main questions that a lot of people ask is how much and how often. I would say that it's a pretty good notion to say that if you stick your finger in the soil and you get about an inch or like to that first knuckle on your finger, that it's moist, then it's good to go. But if it's dry, it definitely needs some water. So that's something you could do daily and check every day. Again, it depends, right? It's so hot right now. So during the summer, you need to water more, but in the winter, probably not as much. But that's a really good check to see. You need to actually feel the soil and see if the plants are getting moisture in the soil. A tip, especially for the summer, is watering in the early morning or late afternoon when the sun isn't just like blazing. And why? Because if you put the water in during like the afternoon and it's blazing hot sun, it's just gonna evaporate, right? It's not gonna be retained in the soil, and then the plants really won't get what they need. And so if you make it a good habit to water in the morning or late afternoon when the sun isn't so hot, or if it's overcast, that's a good habit to make. Some indications of if you water too much or too little, you can kind of see, and these are like very, very basic generic advice, because I would say you need to really look into the specific plants and things like that. But in general, you can see overwatering may tend to make the leaves curl a little bit. And I think a lot of people notice that with tomato plants. So like sometimes the tomato plants the leaves will start curling, and that's probably an indication of too much water. On the other side, underwatering will probably show some yellowing of the leaves or shriveled and wilted leaves. That's kind of like the plant saying like, I'm thirsty, please give me water. Again, with the mulch is a great way to retain the water in the soil. So not only does it help the soil and suppress the weeds, it will retain the moisture in the soil. So another tip is we want to water the soil, not the leaves. And a lot of people forget that. I mean, I forget it sometimes when I'm just trying to like do a bunch of things. But what happens is if you water the leaves and then, for example, the sun comes out, it could burn the leaves, or it could attract pests and things like that. So really the plant is getting its water from its roots. So if you're watering the leaf, it doesn't really do much for it. You want to water directly in the soil where the plant is living. Really quick on fertilizer, this is something that you can add to your water if you have like a watering system. A lot of places you can get liquid fertilizer and mix it in. But if you have something like Nadia was talking about, some like blood meal or feather meal, you can add it on top of the soil and then just water it in. Next slide, please. Really quick, and then I promise Xavier will talk about pests. So again, this is like just a quick question for you to think about what makes sense for your space. Hand watering, just using watering cans or like a hose with a nozzle, that could be just something really easy if you have a smaller space, and it's very easily managed that way. And like in the picture here, students can water for you, and it can be a fun task to do part of your lesson plan. But if you have a bigger space and maybe you're not able to get to your garden every day or things like that, then an irrigation system would make more sense. So you could autonomously do that. So like setting up a sprinkler and a hose so it can just do its thing. A timer will help too. You don't even have to be there. You just set it and forget it, and adjust adjust the settings. And also even a more complex situation, you could have a drip irrigation system where you just have your water lines go and the drip irrigation goes to each separate bed, and the timer kicks on and it waters it for you. So like here's a picture of the garlic growing at Kip, and I know it's hard to see, but there's like black main line hose going there, and then coming out of that main line are two smaller drip irrigation lines that go directly into the bed. So once the water is flowing, it just goes through and it kind of drips out slowly over a set amount of time, and you don't have to hand water it. So so those are options that you can think about. I would say if you're interested in drip irrigation, a good resource is DripWorks, and there's a link in the notes section, and they are a great resource for setting up an irrigation system or just giving you any tips or answering questions that you may have. So thank you for your time. I'm gonna pass it on to Xavier for pest control.
Thank you so much, Emilia. What a great information. Yes, well, I want to try to do my best to explain like the amount of pests you can have in your garden. I want to start with like some pests, like like if you want to like have an idea why we have so many pests, the first thing we have to think about it, many of the plants we grow in, they're not native from the area. So like they're suffering a lot like damage for pests that are around here. So I select some like you will find in your garden. Of course, it's a lot of pests you can find, but I will pick some and I will talk about this one. Next slide, please. So in early spring, probably like the best problem, and it's for experience, I'll say like slugs and snails probably as the first pest appear in the spring because they like like a wet, moisturous, and you see like the picture on the left, they destroying the plant. That's probably you won't see this because they're acting during the night. So they eat probably your whole greens. So eat leaves, they eat stems, they eat flowers, they eat everything. So it's some techniques you can use to avoid this, guys. I will say one of the big tips and is water plants in the morning. Because all over the day, all the water start a little bit drying out from the sun, so they don't have like a lot of chances to get into your plants at night. If you put water at night in the afternoon, they love that because it's wet. It's like a perfect for them. So if you avoid that, you start watering in the morning. I think it's much better. The other thing, it's very important to avoid slugs and snails is like clear the bed of the weeds. Sometimes we forgot for some reason we just let the weeds around. So and the sun basically doesn't go over like the soil. So it keeps like the moisture, and that's what these guys also like to be. So, but if you weed, it will help to prevent like they like going around. But if you can, like let's say like you do everything and you can, basically these guys just keep going every night. You wake up and there's damage for the slugs. You can crush some eggshells around the plants. Very nice, like crush it up and just put around the plants. They don't like it. They hate it because they have like their body is kind of like a little bit like sensitive to any kind of itchy thing, so they don't like that. Or if you still think that's not working, you can add like a copper, like sponge. You will see in the next slides around the stem plant. So now how you recognize it's in a slug damage. Usually in the early spring, you will see like holes in your greens, because we in springtime we mostly have greens, right? So you will start seeing holes around there. Your first thought could be say, oh, there may be slugs and snails, especially if it's kind of like a wet around your plants. Next slide, please. So you can see here, I tried to use like giving us advice and tips, like something you can find in your house or like in the local like hardware store together. So we did this in the demo garden in the spring because nothing worked except this technique. So we went to the store and we buy like a sponge, a special like copper sponge, and we put it around on the stem of the collards in this case, and because the collar was devastated at the beginning of the spring, at middle of the spring, by the slugs. And so we clean it up and say, you can tell over there it's very clean, no weeds around, and we add the copper around. This picture is recently, I mean, like at this point, it's not slugs anymore, but they don't like it, this sponge. So they, again, if you put in a steam around the steam, and they try to climb, they will find this spiky material in special, I believe like copper have some kind of reaction to their skin, so they don't like it at all. So we find out this one, it was a perfect technique to avoid these guys in the spring. At this point, I will repeat, we don't have damage because it's kind of dry. Next slide. So another one, I see these ones in the city, even people can think about it, this one just happening in the gardens or in the farms, but I see a lot of damage for aphids and some gardens around the city. These guys destroy your plants and sucking the sap from the stems and leaves. They can stay all year, all the season sucking the plants. They stay in spring and summer and fall. So it's a lot of techniques how to prevent the damage for the aphids. I put over there some prevention techniques. So if you see a lot of your plants infestation, you mix 1 tablespoon of baking soda with some biodegradable soap and 650 milliliters of 3 cups of water and spread around the plants or direct to the aphids. And also, if you possible, maintain a good number of ladybugs in the garden. If you don't have it and you see around, you can buy ladybugs, believe it or not, you can buy ladybugs and they put in and you spread it out in the garden. If you have infestation, I repeat, if you have just a few, I think with like the baking soda and the soap, it will be enough. I have a little video I talked in spring about like in ladybug, like taking care of aphids. As you can see there, she is doing the job. And she's taking care of like, see this infestation. Unfortunately, this is not a vegetable. This is like a cauliflower. But the work they're doing, it's incredible. And not necessarily aphids, they can eat all like the bugs, like they are not beneficial for you. So like ladybugs, your first friend to gardening. Next slide, please. So about cabbage worm, it's very common, like when you have your brassicas, like your kale, you have like your collards doing beautiful over there, and then suddenly you see like this butterfly flying around your garden. It's like a white, castle, like a black paint also. You have to catch this guy because what this butterfly is trying to put eggs in all your plants, and that means that's going to be the cabbage worm. It will attack specifically your brassicas and appear like a middle late spring, and it can stay all summer. So one thing about brassicas, kale, collards, you can also have a production all summer. The problem is like in summer, like it seems like all like the pests appear and start eating the whole brassicas. But if you have a nice system, for example, if you cover the brassicas with like a raw cover, I think like it will be fine. I mean, you can harvest like kale for 2 years. It's like it becomes like a very tall plant though, but you still can do it. But if you think like maybe no, maybe it's too much to deal with this pest, maybe it's time to get rid of all the plants. And I say like and some people trying to just catch this butterflies is fun because you're going around catching up because you know it's a pest. You gotta recognize very well. It's like a white with black, the kind of black spots on it. Next, please. I put on the list this little guy over here because probably it's one of the most damaged pests you can find in your garden, especially if you love melons, especially if you love cucumbers, pumpkins, and all this family. I see this guy like destroying plants in city gardens. So what like the most damage they do is spread the bacterial wilt. Basically, a disease eventually kill the plants. So it means you don't have you cannot save the plant if you get bacterial wilt. This one appears in spring and basically stay the whole summer. Usually wait until the cucurbits family plants, I would say like cucumbers, summer and winter squash appear, and they just go for them. So I think the best way to do this one is to deal with this cucumber beetle is basically prevent. You cannot save the plant if you get like bacterial wilt. So I have some tips about prevention. And now we have like some plants, they are like resistance to bacterial wilt. So if you want to plant the next time, cucumbers is better, for example, everybody loves cucumbers. You have to look for the seeds is better resistance to bacterial wilt. Otherwise, by this time of the year, you will probably get rid of your whole plants because it's 100% you will get bacterial wilt through the cucumber beetles. But let's say sometimes you get a lot of cucumber beetles, like the population is really high because we never managed before. I think like sticky traps are like one option. So you put sticky traps next to the cucumber beetle plants, the cucumber plants, or like your summer or winter squash plants, and that will help to prevent. But eventually, like even in low population, those guys can spread and this disease. Also, one like tip is not plant like potatoes near to cucumbers. Seems like the cucumber beetle are hiding under the potato because we put first potatoes in the spring, so they appear there and they hiding over there. If you put like the cucumber next to the potato bed, 100% you will get cucumber beetles. And let's say you have like as an example, in this picture right here, you can see like this plant is wilting, maybe 100% it can be bacterial wilt. So what I have to do over there is like basically cut the plant. We cannot save anymore this plant. You just, to prevent like spread this virus to other ones, you just maybe cut this plant and just put it under trash and wash your hands very well and your tools as well. Because like also like the cucumber beetle can spread the disease, but also we can spread the disease. If we use harvest one cucumber with one tool, and then we go to the next plant and cut the cucumber, maybe a healthy plant, and cut other cucumber, we can spread like the bacterial wilt to all of like cucumbers or like summer and winter squash. So the best like tip is wash your hands, wash your tools, or use disinfectant or alcohol your tools to every time when you go and harvest cucumbers, and try to manage the cucumber beetles. I have like a picture about like sticky traps the next slide. So you can tell over there, some people can think about it like, oh, but this one will like, we get a lot like beneficial insects. And in my experience, like, yes, they can catch like some beneficial like insects, like, but not a lot. Most of the insects you get in there, they are bad for your garden. And you can tell over there, some cucumber beetles in the picture, they get a trap over there. So this is like some good ideas you can spread. I can talk about more about many other pests we have in the area, unfortunately. But like you can find more information in astrology about, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to respond for next week. Next slide. Yeah. So sometimes we go to the garden and the plants start looking sad. I want to put this one over here because I see this one a lot in like urban gardening, especially in schools and people who do in pots in your house, like black or yellow spots. Um, Usually happen at the beginning of the spring or maybe by fall. So we kind of like early yellow spots or black spots or late yellow spots. Um, One of the more important things is pruning your plants. Of course, not all the plants get pruning, but this disease is mostly going for, specifically for tomatoes and some cucumber or cucurbits in general. So I think like the general tip is try to prevent like the leaves touching the soil as much as you can, and specifically in the tomatoes. You can tell here it's like a one tomato leaf affected by like a yellow and black spots. So if you pruning constantly your tomatoes and try the leaves not touching the soil, I think is a good way to prevent this one. But let's say it's already spread on the whole plant, and you can use some organic and not toxic products like neem oil. I think like this is my favorite. But if you don't have neem oil, you can use baking soda too. Um, I have some recipe with it. You can find a lot of recipes. I have this recipe, 1 gallon of water with 1 teaspoon of neem oil if you want neem oil, and or 3 cups of water with 1 tablespoon of baking soda. And this is like something you have to do every day for 7 to 14 days, especially in the morning. So if you don't see any results after 7 to 14 days, you probably reconsider like replace the plant. If it's not too late in the season, you maybe just put another plant. But if you're already late in the season, maybe just consider like to do for next year. Next slide. So yeah, this is my list of pests. Unfortunately, I would say like it's so many pests we can talk about it. But in general, I think this like a pest you can find in your garden usually. Of course, it's other animals you can find in your garden, like raccoons are all everywhere. You can kill and eat like your crops. But I think like but in general, I think this is like my list of pests you can find in your garden. Next. Oh yeah, I think this is all I have for you, and I hope like you enjoy this webinar, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Xavier. Thank you so much, all of the presenters. There was a lot of information. Laura, can you go back one slide for 1 sec? So in Schoology, a lot of the references that were mentioned today are listed in there. So definitely feel free to take a look. As you can imagine, we could have done 10 hours on this. We could have done 15 hours of this or 20, but we tried to pack a lot into an hour and a half or a little more. There's some more on here, and I'm sure there will be more to come as we go on. If you all have questions that you want to make sure that we are talking about in the Ask a Gardener section next week, Tuesday, please feel free to throw them in the chat box right now before you hop off. Otherwise, Laura, can you move on to the last slide? Just a reminder, Ask a Gardener session is on Tuesday, and then we've got 2 more great webinars to finish off the Summer Institute this year, outdoor classroom management and teaching in the garden, teaching with standards-based curriculum. So these are going to be the sort of core, how do I actually teach with kids in the garden. So hopefully those will be very valuable, and the corresponding discussion sessions for those. And don't forget, the access code for Schoology is listed down here below. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks very much. Have a good day.